Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Insightful Accountant webinar, a modern and simple approach to check processing, Until Checks Do Us Part, presented by Liz Scott, sponsored by Checkrun. Insightful Accountant is an online news and information source written for small business advisors interested in the latest news and offerings in accounting technology. My name is Emily Hedrick, and I will be your webinar host. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them in the Q&A box and we'll try to address them. Everyone that has registered will receive a follow-up email with the handout and recording later today. Today's speaker is Liz Scott. In addition to serving as Insightful Accountant's contributing QuickBooks Online editor, Liz Scott is an advanced certified QuickBooks advisor and managing member of the Oklahoma City-based firm Accounting Lifeline, which specializes in QuickBooks training, setup, support, and integration services for small businesses. Liz is also a member of the Intuit Trainer Writer Network and writes course curriculum for the accounting community. She presents numerous live and webinar trainings across the US and abroad. Thank you, Liz, for being here with us. And when you're ready, you can get started.
Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. It's always a fun thing to be introduced by somebody, so I appreciate that. And welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am thrilled that you're here because this is going to be a very, very fun overview of some history. And many of you know that I enjoy history. I think that it's fascinating to know where we've come from and then be able to understand the possibilities of where we're going. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and do a brief overview of exactly what we're going to be exploring today while we're together. So we're going to be talking about the history of payments. So there are lots of needs for being needing to create checks and payments. And so that is really the foundation of this webinar is, we understand that technology is here to help us. And so sometimes where we're at is exactly where we need to bring in some technology to help us get further. So that's one of the things we're going to do is we're going to talk about who needs checks, because there is still a large community of people who do. And we're going to explore some of those people, who they are and why they're using them and how they're using them. Then we're going to talk about some workflow. So what is it that we are really looking for? What is it that our clients are really looking for? And then we're going to talk about the possibility of checks. So I like the history part. It's kind of a fun overview, but then really it's all about where are we going? And then I'm going to show you a brief overview of a tool that's out there that is doing some things to modernize the check process. So I'm really happy today that we have Checkrun here. So you can see in the list of presenters that you can see that there's a couple of extra people here besides just myself and Emily, and they're here to answer questions. So as you have questions throughout the webinar, just please put them over in chat. I enjoy the interaction in chat, so feel free to ask questions away. It helps me to know, what is it that you're looking for, and we have a really great group of people here that are going to be answering those questions. So we have you covered. Go ahead and just start asking questions. But where we're going to begin is history. And so history lesson, the background of checks. And if we think about where it all began, we can think about the whole idea of the ancient world needed to be able to have a way to safely store their dollars. And so, gold nuggets wasn't going to get you to be able to pay the bills for very long. Or if you did, then you might just get robbed if you're carrying around your sack of gold. So that's very archaic, but we had this whole idea of we needed to be able to exchange currency. So currency has really taken quite a few different tours in its way to getting to the present day dollar. And some of the things that we did was create the gold bars and then gold coins. And then became very, very apparent that we needed some type of way to make our money lighter weight. So silver certificates became the thing. And so whenever you think about these silver certificates, it really wasn't until about 1790s that we started having a way to standardize some of our checks, because what was happening is you had all these different banks that popped up and they were allowed to create all of their own money. And how confusing is that? So we needed a standard way to do things. So, if we think about now, our focus is truly on standardization. During that time, they really didn't have any, because they had about 1,600 different private banks creating their own currency. So we had this issue of how do we get a standardized type of payment? And so that's when we had a Federal Reserve Act put into place. And now we have one standard bank. And if we think of that one standard bank, the Federal Reserve, this is where you really start thinking about has defined our modern banking system. So banks want to stay in good standing with the Federal Reserve because they get to put on their banks backed by Federal Reserve. Well, what happened was they said we need one standard way to be able to issue payments. So the standard dollar came into play, standard coins came into play. So no longer were banks allowed to have all of their different types of checks that were issued. And you had these question marks as to, are they valid? Is this bank real? And so what happens is now banks must submit themselves to the Federal Reserve and be able to be backed by the Federal Reserve and be able to put that on there. And they've got to stay in good standing with the Federal Reserve because they're issuing payments and they want to be able to stay in good standing. So that means that they're going to continue to submit the activity to one standard place. But if we back up and we think about the history of checks and how it all began with money and currency, we can go all the way back to 352 BC when people really wanted to avoid carrying large sums of money. And so in the 1500s, Amsterdam merchants, they started giving their money to the banks, and the banks would write out these notes so that way they could say, I don't need to carry around these big dollars of cash because I might get robbed or my house gets burned down. And I went from having something to nothing. So what happened was people really had a hard time believing that these paper notes actually had any validity to them. So what happened in 1762, a British banker he's accredited for inventing the serial number. And so those are the numbers that are on the notes as a way of checking on the notes. So he's accredited for coming up with the words check. So he said, we need to have some type of standard numbering system on the checks so we can go back and we can see where are they at and have they all been accounted for. And then we also have a thing that happened in 1830s. Up until this point, one of the things that they would do is they'd have these messengers go around with all of these paper notes and they'd have to deliver them directly to the banks, and they'd be able to say, okay, here's the number of checks that were written to this bank. We need you to go through and then give us money back for these written checks to from people, account holders from your bank. And so what happened was these two messengers just happened to meet up at the coffee shop, or so the story goes. And they decided instead of going all the way to each other's banks, they would meet up in the middle and they would start giving each other their checks that were written to the other banks. And so this became a standard way for messengers to deliver the checks in a neutral position and then go off and then go back to their bank. So they didn't have to make the entire trips. But then a new thing happened. So in the 1950s, we have the MIR code. And so that's that little electronic numbering system that's down at the bottom of the checks that became faster for the banks to electronically read those checks. But at that point, we still had planes that were delivering these checks now back and forth to these different banks. And then a major catastrophe happened. And in 9/11, we had in the US a crash into our Twin Towers. And the banking system, I find this really interesting, had to adapt. So the banking system had to come back and say, oh my gosh, how are we going to exchange these dollars if we can't physically have the plane go land and deliver those checks to that state and those banks? So what they decided to do was to take that standard serial number that's on those checks, and they allowed them to have the Check 21 Act. And what that allows is the banks to electronically take those numbers and process checks to other different banks. Again, that's going through the Federal Reserve because we have to have one place to be able to validate that all of these checks are legit. So lots of things have happened in our check history that I find absolutely fascinating to bring us to more of a modern approach to checks. So if we look at this check here, this check image is courtesy of Johnson & Johnson, and it is the first check that Johnson & Johnson ever wrote in 1886, and they were buying supplies. And so they needed to be able to pay for freight of the supplies that were being delivered. And this just symbolizes our businesses are paying for goods all over the place, all of the time. And so as of today, it is estimated that there is a I'm going to get tongue-tied on this number because it's just so astounding, 21.7 million checks written and issued daily. So when we think about the history of checks and where we're going, that we've adopted them, 21.7 million, that's not a number that's going to just, checks are disappearing overnight. There are people who literally are using these checks and need a really good way to electronically transfer these monies and these funds and create some type of streamlined process. So that's where, there's a couple of things that we can think about. And this is that Act 21 that put into place that whenever you are issuing checks, you have some standardization that has to be in place, which means that you have to have the routing number there. You have to have your account number there. You have to have the check number there, and then you have to have the transit number there. So all of this standardization has been widely adopted. This is the format that's used, and the Federal Act monitors, are you following all of these different protocols that have been put into place? So that's allowed us to then make some leaps that I'm going to show you, but we have a poll. And so this is your, oh goodness, I went backwards instead of forwards. This is your first poll. So Emily, can you launch our poll, and let's take a minute to ask, so what is the most important thing to you in a payment solution? So you have a couple of options here. So I'll allow you a second to get your polling answered. And then I'm going to go ahead and count you down. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So if we can go ahead and launch that. So security and convenience, those are the two number ones. Oh my gosh, I agree with you 100%. Security, yes, we want to make some type of standard way to make sure that we're helping our clients with security issues. And then as accountants and bookkeepers, if we're processing those payments, we sure as heck want to cover our firm too. So really, really important. And then being able to do it in a timely manner. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to continue here. There we go. Great. So when we're thinking about the future of the check possibilities, some of the things that we know is that people are wanting smarter and safer business payments, which is exactly what you just said. They want to be able to have instant payments. So I need to make my payments today. It's Friday, maybe in the office, it's bill payments are done on Friday. So now it's the day, and they need to be able to do other types of tasks that are coming in their way into the office. So they need a way to do it fast. And then also, we know remote work is happening in droves right now. So we have all of these people who need a way to process payments electronically and remote from their various different locations. And secure way, so yes, it needs to be safe, and that we get support whenever we need support. So it's just customary that sometimes if you have a question, you need to have somebody to ask that question to. So those are the things that we know people are looking for. And whenever we're talking about our business, who needs these checks? These businesses needing to pay for goods. So going all the way back to Johnson and Johnson, they needed to pay for freight in order to be able to receive the goods because they had operations that needed to function based on goods that were being shipped. So our businesses are still doing that. Whether it's goods or it's services, there's still electronic payments that need to be issued. And whenever we're thinking about the bookkeepers and accountants, if we are the ones who are paying these payments, we really want to focus on a platform that is simple to manage. We want to be able to help our clients with cash flow. We want to eliminate some of those obstacles that happens whenever we're in the processing of those checks. And we want to be able to have, especially for processing payments for them, a way to electronically go back and see that documented payment. So those are the things that we know, people are looking for, and these are the people who are processing payments, both the businesses and then the accountants and bookkeepers on behalf of the businesses. So if we dive a little bit deeper into who needs checks, I'm just going to pull in that number earlier because I know that we like statistics and we like numbers. 21.7 million checks are being issued daily. So that means that there's a wide range of businesses who are looking for electronic payments. They need to be able to process these. And so I'm just going to do a high level of some of the businesses that are heavily dependent on checks. And I'm sure that you can think of more. You can throw them in chat because I feel like, I'm just going to cover a few. But feel free to pull into chat the experiences that you are having with checks. So law firms, whenever we're thinking about law firms, they're hugely writing checks. They are writing checks because maybe they have a lawsuit that has been settled and now there has to be a payment issued. Most of those payments are not electronic. Most of those payments are paper checks, and sometimes even have two names written on them, the law firm and then the person that they're representing, to be able to say, together we need to cash this check. Sometimes it's just the law firms that cash those checks, and then they need to have a check that's issued directly to the client that they are representing. All of that needs to have a paper trail, and lawyers are very, very heavily reliant on having a solid paper trail. So that's one industry that is probably not going to change much in the dependency on checks. Another one is construction. So I serve a community that includes construction businesses, so home builders or general contractors of some kind. These people are really heavily dependent on a bunch of different accounts in some cases. And my experience is they might sometimes have different bank accounts for different homes that they're building or custom homes that they're building, which means that inside their office, they've got a ton of check stock that's there. And so maybe they've got check stock for this bank and they've got check stock for this other bank. And each of those represent a custom house or a spec house that they're building. But check stock, we know, is not safe just storing in drawers. And so there is an opportunity here to be able to show them a solution that can use blank check stock. So now they're only just keeping one box of checks in their office, and they're allowed to print electronically all of those codes that we know that need to go on those checks, the routing number, the account number, the check number. So all of those details can be added once the check has been approved and now it's being created. So we have some options there to reduce the amount of check stock that's being utilized in the office. Other people who use checks, charitable foundations. So nonprofits are heavily dependent on checks because there's a board that needs to oversee all of the activity. And Another reason that this is very important is there has to be transparency into who spent the money, where did it go, was it cleared? All of these different things are very important to a nonprofit whenever there's a board members that need to sit around and maybe audit all of the checks that are written or that are received. So a lot of times we have businesses that are issuing checks to nonprofits. And so that industry is heavily dependent upon checks. The other people, insurance agencies. So if you have some type of claim on your house, you need to have a check that's issued to you. And again, they do this to safeguard themselves. So if the insurance agent comes out and they say, you get to have a new roof or, whatever it is that needs to be replaced, or maybe you're back in the construction world and, something's happened to a property and the check needs to be issued from an insurance company, they are heavily reliant on checks. And so they need to be able to have a good way to issue these different checks and make sure that sometimes both the individual's name or the business's name and the bank names are on those checks. So both parties need to sign it, and you really can't accomplish that same thing if you're thinking about electronic funds. It's harder to capture those details. The other community that's also reliant heavily on checks are real estate and brokers' offices. And if you think about what's happening is there's one central location that all of these checks are being processed. So a real estate agent, works for a brokerage, and they go out and they have these different sales that they have. Well, those title companies are issuing checks. And then those checks are then in turn from the brokers given to the real estate agents and they're released to them. So this is another community that's very heavily reliant on checks. And again, I just don't see that that's going to change anytime soon. And then if we go over here and we think about who else is using checks, traditional businesses, they're issuing out checks for payments because it's a way for them to be able to document this payment happened, record that inside of my QuickBooks, and then later on, well, I'm a QuickBooks user, so of course I'm going to say QuickBooks, but later on come back and say, okay, it's cleared the bank, so I need to reconcile it. So checks are being used by traditional businesses. Of course, I threw this image of these old check registers. I guarantee some of you here have got clients that are still using these huge books that have these 3 per page checks, and they're going over and writing in the detail. And then somebody has to go back through and use those little stubs to actually enter in the bookkeeping. So I see this from time to time and I'm like, oh my gosh, let me show you a better way. And they are so relieved whenever I get them away from this double duty here. It's like one person's writing the check and the other person's going back and logging the bookkeeping. It's really, really hard because, not everybody has great handwriting. So sometimes that's a guessing game. But there's also this movement of businesses who adopted some of these ACH payments, but are actually trending back to checks. So this is kind of an interesting thing. What's happening is businesses really need to be able to see where dollars are going, and ACH payments are hard to manage. One of the things I can give as a clear example of that is sometimes you have businesses who are trying to maybe pay payments on credit cards. Again, I'm going to go back to the construction workers, and they're making credit card payments and they're making these ACH payments. Well, it's really hard to tie that back to the job. How can you get job costing if you can't track the details? And with electronic funds, sometimes it's hard to go back in and track those details. Not in every case, but there is this trend that's going back to checks because they are familiar, because these checks do have a history of supporting us and being able to say that we understand what payroll checks look like. We understand what these refund checks look like. So that's another reason that checks are being written. And then we understand these bank fees and that we've got to be able to verify the account holders' dollars are in there. So I'm just going to give a fun scenario with this beautiful background here. So, if we think about the check life cycle of clearing, one of the things that's happening is we have these clients such as a lawn service business. Maybe our client has initiated a landscaping business or lawn service business to come and do some mowing services. And so our client then creates a payment to pay for these services that happened. And then the check is the thing that's created. And then we have the mowing business that the check is written to. They are going to go take this check to the bank. And then the bank, we know, has got to verify that these funds exist. So the way that they do it is going back to that whole Check Act 21. What happens is the bank that it has written the check, then there's an electronic communication that happens, and the bank that has received this check needs to electronically verify that there are funds inside of the account. And so what's happening is that bank is making sure that our client actually has the dollars in there to pay for the services that were performed. And so all of that happens over just a brief period of time, but that has to be performed in order for the check for the mowing business to be able to say, hey, I'm going to be able to clear that payment. So that's kind of a real scenario. And if we think about if there's not funds inside of our client's bank account to cover that check, then they're going to get an insufficient fund fee. And if too many of those happen, we know that our banks can start getting into situations where they're penalized if they're not adhering to proper bank standards. This doesn't matter if it's checks or electronic payments. You've got to be able to cover the expenses that you write on your bank account. So one of the things that banks did to help speed up this process is they started doing this thing called next day availability. So if you think about, it took a couple days for both of these banks to talk to each other, that's still true. But one of the things is if you're in good standing with your bank, they do what they call next day availability, because they realize that banks really are and money is the food source for all of these businesses, and they need to be able to operate. So if you're in good standing, you get this next day availability, and that means those funds are going to show up in your bank account the next day, and you can actually start spending them, even though those two banks haven't quit talking to each other, with the Federal Reserve being in the middle. So all of this data goes back and forth to the Federal Reserve, sent back out, checks clear, payments clear, any type of payments. So what can we do to start preventing check fraud? So we know that check washing can happen. We know that check hiding can happen. That's the thing where they transfer different funds around. And then we know that erasing of checks can happen. So one of the things you had said was, hey, there's this whole idea of let's prevent fraud from happening. So to date, that's really been the life cycle of our checks. So we're going to start looking ahead at some of the future of checks. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and say, Emily, can you launch our next poll? And while you're doing that, thank you, Emily, for launching that poll. I'm going to go ahead and look to see, do we have any comments or questions inside of chat? So does anybody have anything that they want to ask? They could go ahead and put those comments into chat. And then I'm going to go ahead and count this poll down. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So if we can close that poll, getting the payments approved and signed. So what's the biggest hurdle? Okay, all right. So this is where the automation comes in, right? This is whenever we start to think about how do we make it a better process? So we know what's been happening. How do we get into a better situation? So it's exactly where we're at. We're going to start talking about the future of checks. So what are businesses looking for? They want to be able to write checks because it feels familiar, but there has to be some improvements that happen in the workflow of it. So if we think about the workflow of the check, this is that process that can be improved. And so one of the things that we want to do is we want to put some safeguards into play. And some of those safeguards are positive pay. So banks allow this back and forth electronic positive pay that we're going to look at here in a second. And then also the automation of the check approval. So that was a big one that you just answered yes to, that you need. And then also the ability to automate that check creation. So if we stop for a second and we talk about positive pay, the way that this actually works is we come over here and we look at positive pay. The way that this actually works is what happens is you tell your bank that there is a list of checks that you have written, and the bank knows check, 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 check. Okay, these are all coming in, but if there's an oddball check that is coming to your bank account, but it's not on your positive pay list, then they do not go ahead and process that payment without first asking you, did you actually write this and forget to send it over? So there's a positive pay list that is generated, and we probably want to automate that because that can be a step that can help us to secure our bank accounts. And that way we know exactly which checks should be clearing our bank, and our bank can help to make sure that we're not processing fraudulent checks. The opposite can be true. So this is whenever the bank says, okay, I'm going to send you the list of all of the checks that came through, then you approve it, and then the bank has the authority to then process it. This is a slower process, and this is the reverse positive pay. I would not recommend unless you have to, but the first option with positive pay is really the optimum in making sure that you don't have fraudulent checks clearing your bank. Another thing that we can do is high security checks. So we want to prevent our check washing. We want to make sure that we have our secure QR code on there. We want to make sure that if anybody tries to wash those checks, that they can't, the fibers actually change, the ink won't wash away. So those are all things that we can do in order to make sure that we are safeguarding ourselves. And it really is worth it to spend a few extra dollars on those. So on those high security checks. So what about the automating of the check approval? So this is where we can say bottlenecks happen and documents get lost. I can tell you that, in some offices, there's really that inbox bin, and sometimes things just sit there. People get busy and it's like, oh, that's a to-do later thing. And so that's a bottleneck that can be prevented. There's ways for electronic optimization to come through and help us with that. Then we also have people that just are out. Right now, especially, people are out of offices. They're not in there. And so it's just much more difficult to share the responsibility if it's a paper check that is sitting inside of a paper bin in somebody's office. So, if we're thinking about that, we've got to have a way to standardize our future of checks. And my thing is that automation should start from the very beginning of the check process. And what I mean by that is, we have OCR ability. So why don't we utilize that? We have tools available to us that we can just scan in that bill. And there's tools out there that can read all of the written documentation on that bill, so we don't have to hand enter it. Now, there's lots of different OCR abilities that are out there, and so you kind of have to decide which one's going to be the one that you use. But QuickBooks has got this OCR ability that is free, and so you can scan in all of your documents and you can say, I need to create this payment. And so maybe you're saying, I don't even need to do a bill and a bill payment. I just can put in, I want to write a check, but you can still submit that bill with the OCR ability to figure it out and read off of there, how much do you owe for that bill? What's the vendor name? What's the due date? All of these things can actually be electronically picked up. And so whenever I say the sooner the better that you start this, I mean, why not use some of these free tools that are available now? So jump in, and if that's just the first step that you take, that is the best step to take in the very, very beginning. But then there has to be these other stages that allow us to be able to automate the rest of this process. So here it is right there. This bill image is stored for later reference. I think it's really key that if you have more than one person inside of a business, you need to have some documentations. That backs up your job. And it also, if you're not the one entering the bills, it backs up the person who is responsible for entering in those payments that need to be made. So whenever you put in the bill, I always say store that image inside of the software so that way at any point, if there's a question about, is this fraudulent, you can go and go, oh, well, here's the bill right here. Or is this something that has been authorized? Right here's the bill image. So lots of really good opportunities to go back and store those images. I think that it's almost, in my opinion, this is going to be the norm, that you just have images stored. So if you're not doing this yet, I would recommend that this be a practice that you start to implement, just because our clients know that this technology is available and they're asking for it. And whenever I give it to them, they're like, thank you. This really, really helps to speed up our bill process because we already see the bill inside of QuickBooks. So that's one of the things that we do inside of our firm, is if we are entering bills on behalf of our clients, we always store these images with that bill. And yes, you are right, it takes a minute longer, but it safeguards everybody. And it just really creates a better workflow. Okay, and then also the approval signature. So we have these physical restraints of, if we have to have somebody in person sign these checks, in person, it just isn't happening right now. So we have to modernize the check signature. And that is something that can happen on a computer, on a phone. There's lots of different options here. And again, I told you that we've got Checkrun here with us today. And so I'm going to show you some of the things that they are doing, but this is what people are asking for. They're asking for a modern way to be able to electronically sign those checks. And then the automation of the check creation. So if I say, okay, it's time to create these checks and I want everything to be ready for Friday, then we can approve all of those bills throughout the week. And then on Friday, we've already gone through and approved our bills, so we're ready for check creation. And if we go in and we say, okay, we've approved these bills, well, then the next thing we can do is we can say, all right, let's schedule all of those to be sent out on Friday. So our bill payment day can still stay the same, even though we're approving the checks, the bills maybe on Wednesday. So we can still schedule our payments and have the same processes in place that have been in practice. And then we also have the ability to automate the approval process. So maybe there's more than one person that needs to approve bills. You have that opportunity to do that. Or maybe the person who enters the bills is not the same person that approves the bills. And in our case, sometimes, these construction workers, we go ahead and we enter the bills for them, but we need their approval before we go ahead and issue payments. Or maybe in your case, you're teaching a client how to use this software so that way they have the approvals that can be sent out. And that way they're processing their own bills and their own bill payments, but you're showing them the options for automation. The other thing that I was talking about earlier is check stock. So you can see here, this is blank check stock. This doesn't have any coding on it. What this means is if you are a firm that is a bookkeeping and accounting firm who is issuing checks, well, you don't have to have all of your different businesses check stocks. You can just have one check stock and you can create all of the checks necessary for all of the different entities that you manage. So saves your office space from having to have a bunch of gazillion different check stocks. And then again, I would say this is the same thing that's true for your clients. So if your clients, they're a brokerage maybe, and they need to have several different accounts that they're writing checks. Maybe they've got their operating account. Maybe they've got their issuing checks to real estate agents account. And so they could have these two different accounts on one check stock because we have software that can actually go through and digitally put that account number and routing number, all the things that are necessary. So we want to automate the check payment creation. And I'm going to go ahead and say, Emily, can you put up our next poll? Because I want to talk about Checkrun and tell you a couple of the different features that they have. So if you had a magic wand to improve the way that your business pays bills, what would you wish for? And I'm thankful that you're answering these polls, because what this really does is this helps us to know, what do you want the education to look like, and what is it that you're really looking for whenever it comes to a solution. So I'm going to go ahead and count our poll down and say 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you, Emily. So payment tracking, wow. Okay, that's really interesting that you're talking about payment tracking and the mobile authorization for check signing. Wow. So I would really say that there's a bunch of split here into the way, what the things that you're looking for, but overwhelmingly people are looking for payment tracking. I'm gonna put this next slide up, and I'm gonna start talking about, we've gone over some ideas of what we're looking for. We've talked about some things that are available to us now in modernization, but I want to review for just a second. One of the things that we were talking about is we want to be able to sync our payments, and we want to be able to store those bill images inside of our accounting solution or bill payment solution, so that way we can go back through them and help with that optimization of being able to automate the check signing. And then we've talked about, the history of checks has changed so much that we have this window for improvement, because we know checks are not going anywhere. We just have too many businesses that are heavily reliant on it. So what we're looking for is a way to improve these payments and bills, and we want to be able to sign them electronically. So this is a big one for us, and we want to be able to customize and then print. So what I'm showing you right here is, based on all of your answers, based on the feedback, based on the things that we've been talking about and hearing, this is the solution that Checkrun has created. So they are truly focused on eliminating that need for pre-printed check stock. They're helping people to work remotely, because they see that that is just what the trend is. That's what people are doing. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of my clients who were in brick and mortar locations and now have gone virtual due to the pandemic has actually created an opportunity for them to stay virtual. So some of those people are actually making decisions to stay virtual, which means that they're working remotely, and that's going to be their trend from then on. So optimization really, automation really means that that's something they need to consider to streamline those processes, and then ultimately still safeguard themselves. Oh, thank you. I see somebody's note there. I appreciate that. Okay, so, what do I mean by automation? Optimization starts, automation, good golly, that word, starts at the very first place. And I'm going to tell you that QuickBooks has got this area that if you're not utilizing it, that I would recommend. So as somebody who's a QuickBooks Online user, there's this tool that is in there that allows you to scan in or email in your receipts or bills. And so I'll just show you on the screen right here. What you're seeing is inside of QuickBooks Online, you've got this on the center, the navigation center, banking. If you click over to receipts, not only can you upload receipts, but you can actually upload bills, which I'm going to show you. And you can upload them from your computer, you can upload them from Google Drive, you can actually email them over, and so you can create users that don't have access to the QuickBooks file, but then you can give them access to just uploading, and then you can actually do it on a mobile device. So you're sending over that data, and what QuickBooks is doing with it is actually saying, okay, down here, the document type, what is it? Is a receipt or bill? And so in your case, it would be a bill. And then you would put in there the details about that bill. And actually, the OCR is going to read that, and it's going to put in the details of the bill for you. And then down at the bottom, you can see that you could put in, is it billable? Do you need to make it, add in a customer or a class? You have lots of options inside of QuickBooks Online, and this is free. And so then you can go ahead and say, save and create that bill. And then the next thing that happens is now in combination with QuickBooks, you're going to do something so that way you're able to start your next process over in Checkrun. So the thing that you would do is you would say, okay, I'm ready to pay that bill, and you would click check mark right here, print later. And so that print later button, what that's going to do is it's going to send a message over to Checkrun that you are ready to process a payment. So you could come over here to the next level, and you could see now we're inside of Checkrun. So based on the work that we did in QuickBooks, we are now going to send that data over into Checkrun, and then we can see here that we can, the payments can be processed here, and because of that little print later button, that means that there's no double entry here. So we're going to be able to get our payment ready for processing. And then the next thing that happens is we have the option to either on a browser or mobile app look at all of those different payments that can be made. So we can check mark those. This is the piece that makes you mobile. This is the piece that makes it where you can start doing some workflows that are remote. The other thing here that you can see is you've got this mobile app, which a lot of people are using inside of Checkrun to go through and check mark the different checks that they want to approve. And then you can actually even e-sign it directly on your mobile device. So this is a big change whenever we're thinking about people who want to be able to process payments remotely, which a lot of you are wanting to do securely, and be able to create some automation here. You can actually go through, and once you have approved that bill or that check to be printed, you can actually sign it right here. So you have then the next option with the signature that is now in place, you could choose a couple of different things. So one, you could actually decide to print your check directly from inside Checkrun, because it's going to have the ability, remember, to print on blank check stock that we were asking for. So based on approving that check for payment, now you can print it on check stock, and that's going to be the thing that's going to allow us to safeguard ourselves from not having pre-printed check stock inside of our office. So we have to have our software open, and we have to have that approval in place in order to be able to print the check. Now, you can print the check because it's a PDF yourself, or you could actually allow Checkrun to do the next piece of it, where you would just have Checkrun process that check for you. So you see right here, this is actually a PDF of that approved payment, and you can print it directly on your printer because now it's got all of the electronic data that you need in it, or you can outsource that. So you have a couple of different options here as far as what you're going to be doing in order to finish up the payment life cycle. The other thing that I was talking about earlier with the Positive Pay is also a feature that is available inside of Checkrun. And it literally is creating that list that says that you can send this over to the bank, and the bank can go through and they can verify that these are the payments that should be processed. So if you are a accounting firm or bookkeeping firm who does Positive Pay, you have this feature in order to optimize that, or if your clients are doing it, it is a feature that is available. The other thing is Checkrun and QuickBooks are talking to each other. And so what that means is you have a bi-directional sync. So QuickBooks creates that check that's ready to be printed, and then Checkrun is looking at that, and it can then at that point electronically send out the approvals. And then the other thing that can happen is once it is approved and the payment has been issued, it's going to send back the data to QuickBooks. So this bidirectional sync means that data is flowing back and forth between QuickBooks Online and Checkrun. And what's brilliant about that is then you can just go back to your work inside of QuickBooks, and you can see down here where the attachment is that is going to be the image of that payment. So you know for sure that it has taken place. Pretty cool. I am going to say at this time, I'm going to ask if Emily, if you can go ahead and put up our next poll, because I am sure that we probably have some questions and I want to get to those. So this is just asking, have you considered using Positive Pay, or do you have clients that are using Positive Pay? How important is that to you? All right, and I'm going to go ahead and count us down. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So we can go ahead and put those results up. So no, but I wish I was doing more safeguards. So that's understandable. Whatever you know that you have some tools out there to help you with those kinds of things, that does actually start the train moving forward to better practices. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and say, do we have some questions? I know that we have some really outstanding help here. So we have a few people that have been answering questions for us in the background. We have Rich, who is here, who's answering questions for us. And we also have Julie and Rachel. They are all part of the Checkrun team. And I want to be able to look at some of the questions that I have been sent directly, and I want to make sure that I am asking those so that way you have an opportunity to have your question asked. So let me look at that. And let me see some of these questions that I have been asked. I'm going to go ahead and say, Rich, it might be best if I ask you these questions and if you could answer them, since you are our Checkrun extraordinaire expert. Rich, are you there? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was. Thank you. Sorry about that. Liz, yes, I am here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So I'd love to get some perspective on these questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask you a few, if that's okay.
Sure.
So what is Positive Pay, and how does my business need it? Why does my business need Positive Pay?
So Positive Pay is basically a mechanism that one, if a company does get hit with check fraud, a lot of times banks force Positive Pay onto businesses and say, we're going to close that account, and to protect you in the future, you're going to have to do Positive Pay. And basically, what Positive Pay is that you send information about the checks that you're printing so that the bank can basically confirm that information. And so any check that was fraudulently made won't be approved, and also or won't be paid. And also, if somebody modified a check, that modification of check would be captured and that check would not be paid.
Wow. Okay, cool. And I think I even heard you say pause pay. And so I'm wondering, is that is that what y'all refer to it in-house? Is it a pay saying Positive Pay? You're just like, hey, pause pay.
I don't know. We've probably been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That was so we accountants, we always love little nuggets of information. So I'm just saying, we'll call it pause pay too. So the next question that I've got here is, the hardest parts of check payments are securing signatures and mailing them out. Is there an easier way? So this is a great question for you, Rich.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what our main goal was with the product, was to make that workflow work. And especially with remote, a lot of times accountants have to go make meetings and drive out to accountant site or to client sites to get checks signed and wait for the person to show up. So we tried to remove that and make the workflow work better. So all that stack of documents that you used to carry around to get the checks approved, all that's available in our mobile apps. And then after you make your decision either to approve or to schedule the payment for a different day, maybe traditionally checks are all done in one day, but yet that a lot of times the CEO will put the check in their drawer. We call it checks in the drawer because it's a big check and they want to wait till they get paid from a vendor. So you can schedule directly in our app what day you want that payment to go out. And when you're done, you just turn your phone sideways, and as you saw, you could sign, and that's the signature we put on checks. So we tried to take the best of the check or the challenges of a check, and we tried to modernize those with the mobile app and that capability.
That's awesome. Well, okay, and this next question is, our whole office is working remotely. And I'm going to throw in that this question didn't have this attached to it, but it says, our whole office is working remotely. And I'm going to throw in, and probably is going to stay that way for a while. How can Checkrun help us?
Well, I think that's the main thing is that the idea that you could do things from any location. And, one of the things that we also added was we can print the checks and mail them for you, so that literally no one has to be in any office to do the final stage of the payment process, which is actually after they've been approved and signed, then to print the checks and then put them in the mail. So we also offer that as an option. You can still print them and hand them out to someone locally, or print them and mail them if that's what you choose to do. But yeah, that's really what the goal is that a lot of people went to electronic payments, and because they wanted the ability to be remote and not have to physically move paper around, et cetera. And so we took and put those capabilities into a check printing process, because that's a lot of times more favorable than pre-funding and not having the remittance information go along with the payment, and some of those things that are drawbacks on the electronic payment side of things.
That's a great answer. So thank you. I agree with you. That's the trend that we're seeing, and wow, it feels like you're handling it well for not just now, but for the future to come. Because I really feel like remote is what we're going to be doing for a while. If not, I have clients who are actually shutting down offices permanently because they just can work remotely. So here's another question. I'm an accountant and I manage multiple clients. Can I have visibility to all of my clients in Checkrun?
Yeah, we have a single sign-on. So you literally, after you authenticate yourself, it gives you a list of the memberships that you are part of. And so you can just go, log into one or choose one, and then do a couple things. And then while you're in the application, there's a drop-down list of the other ones, and you can just pop over to the other one. So you can move back and forth very readily with our system.
Nice, because that's what we want to be able to do, is we want to be able to flip back and forth and have visibility into all of our clients' activity. I have one more question here, so I think we have time for this one question. How do payments get added into Checkrun? And do we enter payments into the Checkrun app, or do they come from QuickBooks Online?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And we made a conscientious decision that we wanted to make sure that QuickBooks Online was a system of record, and that there would be no double entry requirements, so that any payment that Checkrun is going to make available for approval and payment has to be entered into QuickBooks. And so we were literally just waiting for QuickBooks to tell us that a check is ready. And you showed us earlier by just selecting print later, that's a trigger where QuickBooks sends us a signal, and then we go and retrieve all that information. We push it out to the mobile app, and we do a mobile notification to whoever the approvers are, saying there are payments ready to be approved. So it's a very simple interface for people, but at the same time, I think it's the most secure way you could do it is to make sure there's one single master system and a system of record, and QuickBooks Online is that for us.
Well, I appreciate you answering those questions. And I think that what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to tell people about some additional upcoming training coming up, so that way they can get more information. And so before I go to the next slide, I want to also answer a question really quickly to say that somebody had asked about, is Checkrun designed for QuickBooks Online users? And the answer is yes. So yes, Checkrun is designed for QuickBooks Online users. And then the next thing that I'm going to show you is what that workflow actually looks like. And we're going to have a true demo of Checkrun on January 12th. And so look for that date to be posted on the Insightful Accountant website. Look for that date to be posted with a time. That's all coming up. And so that's really going to be a workflow and a demo of Checkrun and QuickBooks Online, how those two systems work together to be able to really create this automated streamlined solution for not just your clients, but also for accountants and bookkeepers who are processing those payments for us. So I want to thank everybody for attending today. And I enjoyed have all of you here. I saw some of my friends online, so hello to all of you. Thank you for joining, and some new faces, so welcome, and I'm glad that you're here. If you've got more information or questions that you would like to have answered from myself, here's my email address, or you've got Checkrun's information, so you can reach out directly to them. And I am not going to guarantee that that adorable little dog is the one who's going to be answering the questions, but isn't he cute? So thank you everyone for joining, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much, Liz. Great presentation today. Thank you, Rich, for being here with us to answer questions, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you all have a great day, and we hope to see you at the next Insightful Accountant webinar. Have a good one.